The dust cloud on the horizon should have been her first warning. As the stagecoach crested the final ridge overlooking Willowbrook Valley, Rebecca Morrison pressed her face to the grimy window, expecting to see the bustling frontier town that Marshal Daniel Crawford had described in his letters. Instead, what greeted her eyes was a scene from her worst nightmares: charred timber reaching toward the sky like blackened fingers, ash-covered streets where families should have been walking, and in silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. The woman who had traveled 2,000 miles from Philadelphia to marry a stranger was about to discover that sometimes the most desperate decisions lead to the most extraordinary destinies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Morrison had never imagined that desperation could taste like dust and smell, like unwashed bodies pressed too close together in a cramped stagecoach. As the wheels of the Overland Stage Company's coach jolted over another rut in the Nebraska Territory Trail, she clutched her worn leather satchel closer to her chest, protecting the bundle of letters that had convinced her to abandon everything, familiar for a future she couldn't even properly envision. At 24, Rebecca had already buried both parents to consumption, watched her younger brother Samuel die at Gettysburg, and seen her modest inheritance disappear into the grasping hands of creditors who showed no mercy to a woman alone in the world. The Philadelphia boarding house, where she'd spent her final months in the East, had been a parade of desperate women, widows, spinsters, and abandoned wives, all competing for the few respectable positions available to females without family. Protection. The advertisement had appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer on a cold February morning that had seemed no different from any other. Honest lawman in thriving Wyoming territory seeks virtuous wife, steady position, comfortable home, growing community. Write to Marshal Daniel Crawford, Willowbrook, Wyoming territory. The words had leapt off the page at her, not because they promised romance. Rebecca had abandoned such foolish notions after Robert Thornton had broken their engagement when her father's debts became public, but because they offered something far more valuable: security and a place where she might actually be wanted rather than merely tolerated. Daniel Crawford's first letter had arrived 3 weeks after she'd sent her careful inquiry, written in bold, confident handwriting on quality paper that spoke of a man who took pride in his correspondence. He described Willowbrook as a prosperous cattle town in the Powder River Valley, where the combination of rich grazing land and the protection he provided had attracted solid, hard-working families looking to build something lasting in the Wyoming wilderness. "I'm 32 years old," he'd written, "and I've been the marshal here for 6 years. The town has grown from a collection of tents and shanties to a real community with proper houses, a school, 2 churches and businesses that serve both. The ranchers and the travelers passing through on their way to the Montana goldfields. I built my house with the hope that someday I'd find a woman who could make it a home, not just a place where a tired lawman hangs his hat at the end of the day." Rebecca had read that letter so many times the paper had grown soft at the folds. There was something in Crawford's careful, measured prose that spoke of loneliness that matched her own, of a man who understood the difference between existing and truly living. His subsequent letters had painted a picture of a life that seemed almost too good to be true. A large house on Main Street, with a garden where she could grow vegetables and flowers. A community of respectable families who would welcome an educated woman from the East, and most importantly, a man who seemed to value intelligence and character over the physical beauty that Rebecca had always known she lacked. "I'm not a romantic man, Miss Morrison," he'd written in his 4th letter, "but I'm reliable, and I believe in treating a woman with the respect she deserves. I'm looking for a partnership, someone who can stand beside me as we build a future together. Willowbrook is a place where a person can become whoever they're strong enough to be, regardless of what they've left behind." The correspondence had continued for 4 months, with each exchange revealing more about their compatibility and shared values. Crawford wrote about his work maintaining order in a frontier town, his involvement in the territorial government, and his hope that Wyoming would achieve statehood within the next few years. Rebecca had shared her love of reading, her experience helping her father with his bookkeeping business before his death, and her dream of perhaps teaching if Willowbrook ever grew large enough to need additional educators. When he'd finally proposed marriage in his 9th letter, including funds for her passage west, Rebecca had accepted with a mixture of relief and genuine anticipation. What did she have to lose? Her alternative was to continue competing with dozens of other desperate women for positions as companion to wealthy invalids or governess to spoiled children who would treat her with the casual cruelty that came naturally to those who had never known want. The journey from Philadelphia had taken 3 weeks, first by railroad to Omaha, then by stagecoach through increasingly wild country that bore no resemblance to the tamed landscapes of Pennsylvania. Rebecca had never traveled farther than the Philadelphia suburbs, and each mile westward had revealed vistas that simultaneously thrilled and terrified her with their vast emptiness. Her fellow passengers on this final leg of the journey were a mixed collection of frontier types that would have scandalized her Philadelphia neighbors. There was Jake Morrison, the grizzled driver who claimed to be a distant relation but had no interest in conversation beyond warning her about the various dangers of Wyoming territory, weather, Indians, and road agents. Inside the coach, she shared space with a whiskey drummer named Patrick O'Sullivan, whose Irish charm couldn't quite mask his tendency to drink his own merchandise, a severe-looking woman named Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, who was traveling to Cheyenne to manage her deceased brother's store, and a young minister named Reverend Timothy Walsh, who was bringing the gospel to the frontier with an enthusiasm that Rebecca found both admirable and exhausting. The conversations during the long, dusty days had revealed the complex motivations that drove people westward. O'Sullivan spoke of markets hungry for any product that could ease the harshness of frontier life. Mrs. Blackwood discussed the opportunities for business people willing to work hard and serve communities that had few commercial options. Reverend Walsh talked about souls in need of salvation and communities that required moral guidance to prevent them from sliding into lawlessness. But it was Rebecca's own motivation that seemed to fascinate her traveling companions most. The idea of a woman traveling alone across half the continent to marry a stranger struck them as either remarkably brave or dangerously foolish, depending on their perspective. "Aren't you afraid he won't be what you expect?" Mrs. Blackwood had asked during one of their longer conversations. "Men can be very different in person than they are in letters." Rebecca had considered this question many times during the long journey. "I'm more afraid of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been possible if I'd had the courage to try," she'd replied. "Besides, Marshal Crawford has been completely honest about what he can offer and what he expects in return. That's more than I can say for most of the men I knew in Philadelphia." The truth was more complicated than she'd been willing to admit to strangers. Rebecca was afraid that Daniel Crawford wouldn't find her attractive enough, afraid that she wouldn't be strong enough for frontier life, afraid that she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But she was even more afraid of the alternative, returning to Philadelphia to join the ranks of women who had simply given up on the possibility of happiness and settled for whatever scraps of security they could find. As the stagecoach rolled through the final day of travel toward Willowbrook, Rebecca had found herself imagining the moment of their first meeting. Would Crawford be waiting at the stage stop? Or would she need to find her way to his office? Would he be as tall and commanding as she'd pictured, or would the reality disappoint her carefully constructed fantasies? Would he take her hand formally, Or might he risk a brief embrace as greeting for the woman who had travelled so far to become his wife? She'd packed her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the colour of her eyes, in her carpet bag for easy access, planning to change into it at the last stage stop before Willowbrook. Her wedding dress, a modest blue silk that had been her mother's second best before illness had made bright colours seem inappropriate, was carefully wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of her trunk. She'd imagined wearing it in the church that Crawford had mentioned, surrounded by the community that would become her new family. The landscape outside the coach windows had grown more dramatic as they approached the Powder River Valley, with rolling hills giving way to genuine mountains that seemed to touch the sky itself. Crawford had written about the beauty of the country around Willowbrook, but Rebecca hadn't been prepared for the way the vastness made her feel simultaneously insignificant and liberated. In Philadelphia, every choice was constrained by social expectations and economic realities that had been established for generations. Here, in this enormous landscape, it seemed like a person might actually have room to become whoever they were strong enough to be. Getting close now, Jake Morrison had called down from the driver's seat as they crested a ridge that revealed the Powder River Valley spread out below them. Willowbrook's just over that next rise. Rebecca had smoothed her traveling dress, checked her hair in the small mirror from her reticule, and prepared to meet the man who had offered her a future when she'd thought all her options were exhausted. Her heart was beating fast, with a mixture of excitement and terror, but underneath both emotions was a deeper feeling that had sustained her through the long journey, the conviction that she was finally, after months of uncertainty, moving toward something instead of just away from disappointment. What she found when the stagecoach crested that final ridge would challenge every assumption she'd made about her future, test every bit of courage she'd managed to summon for this journey, and ultimately reveal strengths she'd never known she possessed. But in those final moments before discovery, Rebecca Morrison was simply a young woman who had risked everything on the hope that somewhere in the vast American frontier there might be a place where she could build a life worth living. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence was the first thing that struck Rebecca as wrong. Not the peaceful quiet of a town at rest, but an absolute absence of sound that seemed to press against her eardrums like a physical weight. No children playing in yards, no merchants calling their wares, no horses nickering in corrals, no hammering from workshops, nothing but the wind whistling through broken timber and the creak of the stagecoach wheels as Jake Morrison brought them to a halt in what had once been Willowbrook's main street. Rebecca climbed down from the coach on unsteady legs, her carpet bag clutched in hands that had begun to tremble. The smell hit her next, the acrid stench of old smoke mixed with something else, something organic and terrible that made her stomach lurch. She pressed her handkerchief to her nose, trying to block out the odor while her eyes took in the full scope of the devastation surrounding them, where Daniel Crawford's letters had described neat rows of houses with painted shutters and flower gardens. Rebecca saw only blackened foundations and collapsed walls. The church steeple that he'd mentioned with such pride lay toppled across what had been the schoolhouse, its bell half buried in debris. The general store, the hotel, the saloon, the marshal's office, every building that had comprised the thriving community of Willowbrook had been reduced to ash and scattered timber. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," whispered Patrick O'Sullivan, the whiskey drummer who had seemed unshakable throughout their journey. His face had gone pale beneath his red beard as he surveyed the destruction. What kind of devils could do this to innocent people? Mrs. Blackwood emerged from the coach with her usual stern composure, but Rebecca could see the shock in her eyes as she took in the scene. Even Reverend Walsh, who had maintained an optimistic commentary on everything they'd encountered during their travels, stood speechless in the middle of what had been Willowbrook's town square. Jake Morrison climbed down from the driver's seat. With the slow, careful movements of a man who had seen too much violence in his years on the frontier, he removed his hat, running gnarled fingers through his graying hair as he studied the ruins with the practiced eye of someone who understood the mechanics of destruction. "Kiowa war party, most likely," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of professional assessment. "Maybe Cheyenne. Hit fast and hard, probably before dawn when folks were still sleeping, burned everything they couldn't carry off, took everything else." Rebecca felt her knees threaten to buckle as the implications crashed over her. The town where she was supposed to start her new life didn't exist. The community that Daniel Crawford had described with such affection had been wiped from the earth as thoroughly as if it had never been. The marshal she'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry was almost certainly dead, along with every person who had called Willowbrook home. "The people," she managed to whisper, though speaking the words made the horror more real. "What happened to all the people?" Jake's expression grew even more grim. "Some probably got away into the hills if they saw the attack coming. Indians usually. Hit at dawn. Gives folks a few minutes to run if they're lucky, but most—" He gestured helplessly at the ruins around them. "Most wouldn't have had time to get out." Mrs. Blackwood stepped closer to Rebecca, her stern features softening with uncharacteristic sympathy. "My dear, I'm so sorry. This is a terrible tragedy, but you mustn't give up hope entirely. There may be survivors who escaped to other settlements." But Rebecca barely heard the older woman's attempts at comfort. She was staring at the ruins of what had clearly been a substantial house at the end of Main Street, its stone foundation and chimney still standing amid the wreckage of what had been the wooden structure. Something about its location and size made her certain this had been Daniel Crawford's home, the house he'd built with hope for the future, the place where he'd imagined starting a family with a wife from the East. The weight of her situation began to settle on her shoulders like a physical burden. She was stranded in the middle of the Wyoming wilderness with less than $10 to her name, no way to return east, and nowhere to go. The man she'd come to marry was almost certainly dead. The community she'd hoped to join had been destroyed. The future she'd carefully planned had literally gone up in smoke. "Miss Morrison," Reverend Walsh said gently, approaching with the careful manner he might use with a wounded animal. "This is a terrible shock, but we must trust in God's plan. Perhaps there's a reason you weren't here when this tragedy occurred." Rebecca looked at the young minister with something approaching anger. What reason could there possibly be for all these innocent people to suffer and die? What plan could justify destroying an entire community of families who were just trying to build decent lives? The Reverend opened his mouth to offer some platitude about God's mysterious ways, but Rebecca had already turned away from him. She began walking toward the ruins of the house she believed had been Daniel Crawford's, stepping carefully around debris and trying to imagine what the place had looked like when it was whole. The stone foundation revealed the outline of a substantial home, parlor, kitchen, dining room, and what would have been bedrooms upstairs. She could see the remains of a garden plot behind the house, where someone had planted vegetables that had long since withered or been trampled. A well with a hand pump stood intact near what had been the kitchen, suggesting that whoever had built this place had planned for long-term habitation rather than temporary shelter. "You shouldn't be walking around alone, miss," Jake Morrison called after her. "Could be dangerous, unstable timbers, holes you can't see, and sometimes—" He paused, clearly reluctant to voice his concern. "Sometimes what?" Rebecca asked, though part of her didn't want to hear the answer. Sometimes the bodies weren't all burned completely. Been animals around since this happened, scavenging. You don't want to see what's left. The brutal reality of his words should have sent Rebecca retreating to the safety of the stagecoach, but instead she found herself examining the ruins more carefully. If Daniel Crawford had died here, if his body was somewhere in this wreckage, she felt she owed him the courtesy of knowing. The man had offered her hope when she'd had none, had painted pictures of a future that had seemed worth risking everything to pursue. The least she could do was face the truth of what had happened to him. As she picked her way through the debris of what had been the front room, something caught her eye. A glint of metal partially buried under a fallen beam. She knelt, carefully brushing away ash and splinters to reveal a marshal's badge, tarnished but intact. The star-shaped piece of tin bore the words, "Marshal Willowbrook, Wyoming Territory," engraved in simple block letters. Rebecca lifted the badge with hands that shook as she realized she was holding all that remained of Daniel Crawford's official authority, perhaps all that remained of the man himself. She'd expected to feel overwhelming grief at this confirmation of his death, but instead she found herself filled with a cold, practical fury at the senseless waste of it all. This badge represented more than one man's death. It symbolized the destruction of everything he'd worked to build and protect. The families who had trusted him to keep them safe, the businesses that had thrived under his protection, the children who had grown up thinking Willowbrook was a place where they could build their own futures someday. All of it wiped away in a single night of violence that had served no purpose except destruction. "Found something?" Jake Morrison asked, having approached despite his own warnings about the dangers of exploring the ruins. Rebecca held up the badge, and Jake's weathered face grew even more solemn. "That'd be Marshal Crawford's, then." "Good. A man, from what I heard. Been through here a few times over the years, always found him fair and competent, kept the peace without being heavy-handed about it." "You knew him?" Rebecca asked, startled by this connection to the man she'd never met. "Not well, but I knew of him. Reputation travels in this country, and Crawford had a good one. Honest lawman, didn't take bribes or play favorites, the kind of man you could respect whether you agreed with him or not." Jake studied Rebecca's face carefully. "You really came all this way to marry him?" Rebecca nodded, unable to trust her voice. The reality of her loss was beginning to penetrate the shock that had protected her during these first terrible minutes of discovery. "Then you lost someone worth mourning," Jake said simply. "And I'm sorry for it." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, causing Jake to immediately reach for the rifle he kept mounted beside the driver's seat. In the distance, a small group of riders was approaching from the direction they'd come, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. "Could be trouble," Jake muttered, checking his weapon. "When a place like this gets hit, sometimes the raiders come back to see if anyone's shown up to salvage what's left." Mrs. Blackwood and the others quickly moved closer together, forming a defensive group near the stagecoach. Patrick O'Sullivan pulled a small pistol from his coat, while Reverend Walsh clutched his Bible as if it might serve as both shield and weapon. But as the riders drew closer, Rebecca could see they weren't the war-painted Indians that Jake's warning had prepared her for. These were white men, 5 of them, wearing the rough clothes of frontier travelers, but riding with military precision that suggested some kind of official authority. The leader of the group was a tall man with dark hair and a beard that couldn't quite hide the gaunt lines of his face. He sat his horse with the easy competence of someone who'd spent years in the saddle, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of recent hardship, of a man who'd been pushed to the limits of endurance and beyond. As the riders approached the stagecoach, the leader's eyes swept over the group of travelers before fixing on Rebecca with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. There was something familiar about his features, though she was certain she'd never seen him before. "You folks are either very brave or very foolish to be stopping here," the man said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. This place isn't safe for travelers, especially not with women in the group. We're just passing through, Jake replied carefully, clearly uncertain whether these men represented help or another kind of danger. Stage route to Montana territory. Didn't know about this. He gestured at the ruins surrounding them. The bearded man's gaze returned to Rebecca, studying her with an attention that made her both uncomfortable and strangely hopeful. "You're not just passing through," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Nobody stops in Willowbrook anymore unless they have business here. What's your business, miss?" Rebecca found herself clutching Daniel Crawford's badge tighter as she met the stranger's intense stare. Something about his manner, about the way he carried himself, reminded her strongly of the lawman whose letters had brought her to this destroyed place. "I came to marry Marshal Daniel Crawford," she said, lifting her chin with a dignity she didn't entirely feel. "I'm Rebecca Morrison from Philadelphia." The effect of her words on the bearded stranger was immediate and dramatic. His face went white beneath his tan, and his hand instinctively moved toward the gun at his hip before he caught himself. The other riders exchanged glances that spoke of shared knowledge and concern. "Jesus Christ," the man whispered, then caught himself and looked apologetically at Reverend Walsh. "Pardon me, Reverend, it's just, Miss Morrison, you shouldn't be here. Nobody should be here. This place is cursed." "Who are you?" Rebecca asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. The man straightened in his saddle, and for a moment she could see past the weariness and pain to the confident lawman he must once have been. "I'm Daniel Crawford," he said quietly, "and you're supposed to be dead." The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Rebecca stared at the man who claimed to be Daniel Crawford, searching his haggard features for any resemblance to the confident lawman she'd imagined from his careful, optimistic letters. This man looked like he'd been carved from stone and weathered by wind, hollow-cheeked, with eyes that held depths of pain she couldn't begin to fathom. "You're supposed to be dead," he repeated, dismounting from his horse with movements that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion. "I wrote to you 3 weeks ago, told you not to come, told you there was nothing left here for anyone." Rebecca's mind reeled as she tried to process this information. "I never received any letter. I was already traveling when you must have sent it." She held up the tarnished badge she'd found in the ruins. "I thought you were dead. I found this in what I believed was your house." Daniel's face went even paler as he recognized the badge. "That's mine, all right. Lost it the night of the attack when part of the roof came down on me." He looked around at the ruins with an expression that mixed grief and rage in equal measure. "Along with everything else I thought mattered." The other riders had dismounted as well, and Rebecca could see they were all cut from the same cloth as their leader. Hard men who'd seen too much violence, survivors who'd learned to carry their losses like weapons. One of them, a grizzled man with a grey beard and a missing left arm, stepped forward. "Daniel, we can't stay here long. You know they could come back, and we've got civilians to think about now." His eyes moved to Rebecca and the other stagecoach passengers with obvious concern. "I know, Pete," Daniel replied, but his attention remained fixed on Rebecca. "Miss Morrison, you need to understand what you've walked into. Willowbrook isn't just destroyed, it's become a death trap for anyone foolish enough to linger here." Jake. Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Marshal Crawford, if that's really who you are, we need to know what happened here. My passengers have a right to understand the danger they're in." Daniel looked at the stagecoach driver for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he seemed to reach some internal decision. "The attack came 6 weeks ago," he began, his voice taking on the flat, factual tone of a man reciting evidence in court. "Kiowa War Party, about 30 warriors, led by a war chief named Iron Wolf, who'd been raiding settlements from the Dakotas down to Colorado. They hit us just before dawn, when most folks were still sleeping." Rebecca felt her stomach clench as Daniel continued his account, but she forced herself to listen. She needed to understand what had happened to the man whose letters had given her hope, to the community she'd planned to join. I was making my final patrol of the night when I saw the fires starting. By the time I got back to town, half the buildings were already burning. The raiders weren't just looting, they were methodical about it. Every building searched, every hiding place violated, every person who couldn't run fast enough either killed or taken. Mrs. Blackwood had moved closer, her stern features softening with sympathy. "How many people lived here, Marshal?" 67 souls, Daniel replied without hesitation. Families, mostly. Good people who'd come here because they believed Willowbrook was safe, protected, because they trusted me to keep them safe. The weight of responsibility in his voice was so heavy that Rebecca instinctively stepped closer to him, though she couldn't have explained why. There was something in his bearing that reminded her of her brother Samuel when he'd returned from his first battle, the look of a man who'd seen his certainties destroyed and was struggling to find solid ground beneath his feet. "How many survived?" Reverend Walsh asked gently. Daniel's jaw tightened. 14 made it to the hills, mostly women and children who ran when the shooting started. They're safe now. I got them to Fort Laramie 2 weeks ago, but the rest—" He gestured at the ruins surrounding them. 53 people dead or taken. An entire community wiped out in one night because I wasn't good enough at my job to see it coming. Rebecca felt tears starting in her eyes, not just for the strangers who died, but for the man standing before her, who was clearly being consumed by guilt over losses he couldn't have prevented. She'd seen the same destructive self-blame in her father after her mother's death, the way guilt could become a poison that destroyed a person from within. "It wasn't your fault," she said quietly, and Daniel's eyes snapped to her face with an intensity that made her step back. "Wasn't it?" His voice carried a dangerous edge. "I was the marshal. I was supposed to protect these people. I was supposed to know when danger was coming and be ready for it. Instead, I was out playing lawman while families were being butchered in their beds." One of Daniel's companions, a younger man with sandy hair and a bandaged left hand, spoke up. "Daniel, you can't keep doing this to yourself. Iron Wolf's band had been hitting settlements for months. Nobody could have predicted they'd come this far south. Could have, should have, would have," Daniel said bitterly. "Doesn't bring back the Jenkins family or old Sarah Mitchell or any of the others, and it doesn't change the fact that I failed every person who counted on me to keep them safe." Rebecca found herself studying Daniel Crawford with new understanding. The confident, optimistic lawman who'd written those careful letters had been shattered by the destruction of his town, replaced by a man who was carrying the weight of 53 deaths on his shoulders. She recognized the symptoms because she'd lived through them herself after Samuel's death. The way guilt could become an identity, a familiar pain that felt safer than the risk of caring about anything new. "What are you doing now?" she asked. "You and your men, I mean. Are you tracking the raiders?" Daniel's expression grew even grimmer. "We've been tracking Iron Wolf's band for 6 weeks. They hit 2 more settlements after Willowbrook, a trading post on the Sweetwater River and a ranch near South Pass. Same pattern every time. Fast, brutal, thorough." Pete, the one-armed man, checked the son's position with obvious anxiety. "Daniel, we really need to move. This place makes me nervous in daylight, and we've got a long ride back to camp." "What camp?" Mrs. Blackwood asked. "Are there other survivors?" "No," Daniel replied. "Just us 5. We're living rough while we track the war party. No permanent base, no settled routine, not exactly suitable conditions for—" His gaze moved to Rebecca again, and she could see him struggling with the implications of her presence. Rebecca felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. Daniel, Crawford wasn't just a survivor of the Willowbrook massacre. He was a man on a mission of vengeance, living like an outlaw while he hunted the raiders who'd destroyed his town. The future he'd offered her in his letters didn't exist anymore. replaced by a life of violence and uncertainty that had no room for a wife or any kind of normal existence. "You can't be thinking of staying with them," Jake Morrison said, clearly reading the direction of her thoughts. "Miss, these men are living like wolves, hunting killers across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. That's no life for a woman, especially not one with your background and education." "What alternative do I have?" Rebecca asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I have no money to return east, no family to take me in, no prospects for employment in the middle of nowhere. Marshal Crawford offered me a future, and even if that future has changed, it's still more than I had in Philadelphia." Daniel shook his head firmly. "Miss Morrison, you don't understand what you're suggesting. We're not living, we're just surviving until we can find Iron Wolf and his warriors. We sleep on the ground, eat whatever we can hunt or find, and every day brings the possibility of violent death. That's not what I promised you in my letters." "What you promised me in your letters was a partnership," Rebecca replied, feeling a strength she hadn't known she possessed rising in her chest. "Someone to stand beside you as you built a future. Maybe the future has changed, but I'm still willing to stand beside you if you'll have me." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind whistling through the ruins of Willowbrook. Rebecca could see the other men exchanging glances, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a woman joining their hunting party. But Daniel was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You have no idea what you're asking for," he said finally. "We're not building anything, Rebecca. We're not creating or protecting or nurturing. We're just instruments of vengeance, and that's all we'll be until this is finished." "And what happens when it's finished?" Rebecca asked. "When you find Iron Wolf and settle the score? What then?" Daniel looked genuinely surprised by the question, as if he'd never considered the possibility of a future beyond his mission of revenge. "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't thought that far ahead." Rebecca felt a familiar stirring of purpose, the same feeling that had sustained her through the darkest days after her family's deaths. This man needed her, not for the reasons he'd outlined in his letters, but for something far more fundamental. He needed someone to remind him that life could be about more than just surviving and seeking vengeance. "Then maybe that's why I'm here," she said simply. "Maybe I didn't come to Willowbrook to join a thriving community. Maybe I came to help one man remember that he's still alive, not just a ghost haunting the ruins of his failures." Patrick O'Sullivan, who had been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Begging your pardon, miss, but this is madness. You're talking about throwing your life away on a man you've never met, joining a vendetta that could get you killed. Surely there are better options." "Are there?" Rebecca asked, looking around at her fellow travelers. "Mr. O'Sullivan, you're riding territory to territory, selling whiskey to men who drink to forget their troubles. Mrs. Blackwood, you're taking over a dead man's business in a town you've never seen. Reverend Walsh, you're bringing God's word to people who may not want to hear it. We're all taking risks, gambling our futures on possibilities that might not work out. At least I'm gambling on something I believe in." Daniel was studying her with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. "And what exactly do you believe in, Miss Morrison?" Rebecca met his gaze steadily, feeling more certain of her answer than she'd felt about anything in months. "I believe in you, Marshal Crawford. Not the man you were before Willowbrook was destroyed, but the man you are now. The man who's spent 6 weeks tracking killers to prevent them from destroying other communities. The man who got 14 survivors safely to Fort Laramie, even though it meant delaying his pursuit of vengeance. That's a man worth standing beside, regardless of how difficult the circumstances might be." The transformation in Daniel's expression was subtle but unmistakable. For just a moment, the haunted look in his eyes was replaced by something that might have been hope, or at least the memory of what hope felt like. But before he could respond, Pete grabbed his arm urgently. "Daniel, We've got riders coming from the north. Could be trouble. In the distance, Rebecca could see a dust cloud approaching fast, too fast for casual travel. Daniel immediately shifted into the alert, focused mode of a lawman facing potential danger. "Everyone get behind the stagecoach," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority that had made him an effective marshal. "Jake, you armed?" "Rifle and a scattergun," Jake replied, already moving to retrieve his weapons. As the group took defensive positions, Rebecca found herself crouched beside Daniel, behind the limited protection of the stagecoach wheel. Up close, she could see the scars on his hands and the way his eyes constantly scanned for threats, evidence of the hard life he'd been living since Willowbrook's destruction. "Miss Morrison," he said quietly, checking his revolver, "if this goes bad, you stay down and let us handle it, understand?" Rebecca nodded, but as she watched Daniel prepare for what might be another violent confrontation, she felt her resolve only strengthen. This was a man who'd lost everything, but was still fighting to protect others, still putting himself at risk for people he barely knew. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever hardships came with joining his mission, she was more certain than ever that her place was beside him. The riders were close enough now to make out individual figures, 6 men in trail clothes, riding hard toward the ruins of Willowbrook with the urgency of men bringing important news. "You recognize them?" Pete asked Daniel. "No," Daniel replied grimly, "but out here, unknown riders usually mean trouble." As the approaching horsemen drew near enough to hail the group, Rebecca realized that her new life, whatever form it might take, was about to begin in earnest. The comfortable certainties of her journey west were gone, replaced by the immediate realities of frontier survival and the complex challenge of building something meaningful from the ashes of destruction. But for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she felt truly alive. The approaching riders turned out to be territorial marshals from Cheyenne, led by a heavy-set man named Marshal William Hensley, whose official bearing immediately put Daniel and his men on edge. As the government lawman dismounted near the ruins of Willowbrook, Rebecca could sense the tension crackling between the two groups like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Marshal Crawford," Hensley said, his tone carrying the weight of federal authority. "We've been looking for you. There are some serious questions that need answering about your activities over the past 6 weeks. Daniel's hand remained near his gun, though he didn't draw it. "What kind of questions, Hensley? Last I checked, tracking killers was still part of a lawman's job. Tracking, yes. Vigilante justice, no." Hensley pulled out a leather portfolio filled with official documents. "We've had reports of 5 men, matching your description, operating outside territorial authority, intimidating witnesses, threatening civilians, and generally taking the law into their own hands." Rebecca felt her stomach drop as she realized the implications. Daniel and his men weren't just hunting raiders, they were operating as outlaws themselves, outside the protection of legal authority. The territorial government considered them as much a threat as the Indians they were tracking. "Those reports are lies," Pete said angrily, his one good hand clenching into a fist. "We haven't hurt any innocent people. We've been trying to stop Iron Wolf before he hits another settlement." "Maybe," Hensley replied, "but you've been doing it without legal authority, which makes you vigilantes. The territorial government can't have armed groups operating independently, no matter how noble their intentions might be." Daniel stepped forward, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "The territorial government wasn't much help when Willowbrook was burning. Where were you federal marshals when 67 innocent people needed protection? We can't be everywhere at once, Crawford, and you know it. The territory is too big, and we don't have enough men. But that doesn't give you the right to take justice into your own hands." Rebecca watched this confrontation with growing alarm. She could see that Daniel was walking a thin line between justice and revenge, between lawman and outlaw. The man who'd written those careful, optimistic letters about building a future, had been replaced by someone who lived entirely in the violent present, focused only on settling scores with the past. "What exactly are you saying, Hensley?" Daniel asked. "That we should just let Iron Wolf and his warriors continue raiding settlements while you file paperwork in Cheyenne? I'm saying you need to return to legal authority if you want to continue this pursuit. Work with us, provide intelligence and tracking support, but let properly authorized marshals handle the actual law enforcement." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken conflict. Rebecca could see Daniel weighing his options, trying to decide whether cooperation with territorial authority was worth the constraints it would impose on his mission. "And if I refuse?" Daniel asked quietly. Hensley's expression grew stern. "Then I'll have to place you and your men under arrest for operating outside territorial authority. There are warrants sworn out for all of you." Rebecca felt shock hit her like a physical blow. The man she'd traveled across the continent to marry wasn't just a survivor seeking justice. He was a wanted fugitive whose pursuit of vengeance had put him on the wrong side of the law. Jake Morrison cleared his throat nervously. "Marshal Hensley, what about my passengers? We're just travelers who happen to stop here. We're not part of whatever's going on between you and Crawford." "Your passengers are free to continue their journey," Hensley replied. "Though I'd recommend they do so quickly. This area isn't safe for civilians." Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, her stern features showing unusual concern. "Marshal Crawford, surely you can see that cooperation with legal authority is the sensible course. These men can provide you with resources and support you don't have operating alone." But Daniel was shaking his head. "You don't understand what's at stake here. Iron Wolf isn't just another raider chief. He's building something bigger, gathering warriors from multiple tribes, planning attacks on a scale that could threaten every settlement from here to Denver. The territorial marshals move too slowly, follow too many rules. By the time they organize a proper response, hundreds more people could be dead." Hensley consulted his documents again. "According to our intelligence, Iron Wolf's band consists of maybe 30 warriors. Dangerous, yes, but hardly the threat you're describing." "Your intelligence is wrong," said Tommy Morrison, the youngest of Daniel's men. "We've been tracking them for 6 weeks. They've picked up recruits from at least 4 different tribes. Last count put them at nearly 70 warriors, and they're moving toward the mining camps in the Black Hills." Rebecca felt pieces clicking together in her mind. If Daniel was right about the scale of the threat, then his unauthorized pursuit might be the only thing standing between Iron Wolf and a massacre that would make Willowbrook look small by comparison. "Marshal Hensley," she said, stepping forward, despite the surprised looks from both groups of men, "what proof do you have that Marshal Crawford and his men have committed any actual crimes?" Hensley looked at her with obvious confusion. "Ma'am, this isn't really your concern. You should get back in that stagecoach and continue on your way." "Actually, it is my concern," Rebecca replied, feeling the same determination that had carried her through the darkest days after her family's deaths. "I'm Rebecca Morrison, Marshal Crawford's intended wife, and I have a right to understand what he's being accused of." The revelation sent ripples of surprise through both groups. Hensley's eyebrows rose as he reassessed the situation, while Daniel stared at Rebecca with a mixture of amazement and alarm. "Miss Morrison," Daniel said urgently, "you need to stay out of this. These charges could be serious." "What charges exactly?" Rebecca pressed, looking directly at Hensley. "What specific crimes are you alleging?" Hensley consulted his papers again, clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "Intimidation of witnesses, threats against civilians, operating armed patrols without authorization, interfering with territorial law enforcement." "Those are very general accusations," Rebecca observed. "Do you have specific incidents, dates, witnesses, or are these just rumors and complaints from people who don't like the idea of private citizens taking action when government authority fails?" The territorial marshal's discomfort was becoming more obvious. "Miss Morrison, I appreciate your concern for your intended husband, but these are legal matters that require—" "Legal matters require evidence," Rebecca interrupted, drawing on. Her experience helping her father with his business dealings in Philadelphia. "Accusations require proof. Do you have signed statements from victims, documented incidents with specific details, or are you simply responding to political pressure from people who find Marshal Crawford's independence inconvenient?" Daniel was staring at her with undisguised amazement. "Rebecca, you don't understand what you're getting involved in." "I understand perfectly," she replied. "I understand that you've been tracking dangerous killers while territorial authorities sit in their offices writing reports. I understand that you've prevented at least one more massacre by staying on Iron Wolf's trail. And I understand that some people find it easier to criminalize effective action than to admit their own failures." Hensley's face was flushing red with anger and embarrassment. "Miss Morrison, you're interfering with federal law enforcement." "I'm asking questions that any citizen has a right to ask," Rebecca shot back. "If you want to arrest Marshal Crawford, then present your evidence. If you can't do that, then stop wasting everyone's time with vague accusations and bureaucratic intimidation." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of a gunshot from the direction of the hills surrounding Willowbrook. Everyone immediately went for their weapons, but Daniel held up a hand for silence as he listened intently to the echoes rolling across the valley. "That was a signal shot," he said grimly. "We posted a lookout on the ridge. Someone's coming and it's not friendly." Hensley looked around nervously. "What kind of someone?" "The kind that killed 67 people 6 weeks ago," Pete replied, checking his rifle. "Iron Wolf scouts, most likely. They sometimes come back to see if anyone's salvaging from the ruins." The territorial marshals suddenly looked much less confident about their official authority. Rebecca could see them calculating the odds of a firefight with hostile Indians while encumbered by civilians and bureaucratic procedures. "How many men do you have, Hensley?" Daniel asked, his tone becoming businesslike as he shifted into tactical mode. "6, including myself. But we're not equipped for a major engagement. We came here to serve warrants, not fight a war." Daniel looked at his own men, then at the stagecoach passengers, making rapid assessments of defensive capabilities and escape routes. "Jake, how fast can you get your passengers out of here?" "Fast enough if we leave right now," Jake replied, already moving toward his team of horses. "But the trails narrow through the canyon. If there are hostiles up there, we could be riding into an ambush." Rebecca felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. In the next few minutes, she would have to choose not just where to go, but who she wanted to become. She could climb back into the stagecoach with the other passengers, return to the relative safety of civilization, and try to rebuild her life in some other place with some other prospects. Or she could commit herself fully to the dangerous path that Daniel Crawford was walking, accepting all the risks and uncertainties that came with it. "Miss Morrison," Hensley said urgently, "you need to get in that stagecoach right now. This is about to become very dangerous." Rebecca looked at Daniel, who was watching her with an expression that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. She could see him struggling with the desire to keep her safe and the knowledge that her presence had already changed something fundamental about his mission. "Marshal Crawford," she said formally, her voice carrying clearly across the ruins of Willowbrook. "I believe you offered me a partnership. Does that offer still stand?" Daniel stared at her for a long moment, and Rebecca could see the internal war playing out in his features. Finally, he seemed to reach some crucial decision. "It does," he said simply, "but you need to understand what you're accepting. This isn't the future I described in my letters. This is dangerous, uncertain, and very possibly fatal." "I understand," Rebecca replied, moving to stand beside him, "but it's also necessary. And I'd rather face necessary dangers with someone I believe in than safe uncertainties alone." The sound of more gunshots from the hills made the decision urgent. Whatever philosophical debates they might have about justice versus vengeance, legal authority versus individual action would have to wait. Right now, survival was the only priority that mattered. "Hensley," Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command in crisis situations. "You can arrest me later if we all live through this. Right now, I suggest we work together to keep everyone alive." The territorial marshal looked around at the ruins of Willowbrook, the approaching threat from the hills, and the small group of people depending on his decision. "What do you recommend?" "Get the stagecoach moving toward the canyon, but keep it slow enough that we can provide escort. My men and I will take point and flanks. Your people can guard the rear. If we hit trouble, the civilians take cover while we handle the fighting." As the two groups of lawmen began organizing their hasty alliance, Rebecca felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration unlike anything she'd ever experienced. In the space of an hour, she'd gone from a disappointed mail-order bride to a partner in a dangerous mission that could determine the fate of countless innocent people. But as she climbed onto her horse, a spare mount that Tommy Morrison quickly provided, Rebecca realized that she'd never felt more certain about anything in her life. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers they would face together, she was finally exactly where she belonged. The woman who had left Philadelphia seeking security had found something far more valuable, a purpose worth risking everything to achieve. The ambush came at Deadman's Canyon, where the trail narrowed between towering rock walls that channeled travelers into a natural killing ground. Rebecca had been riding behind Daniel for 20 minutes, learning to handle her horse while watching the way he constantly scanned the terrain for threats, when the first war cry echoed off the canyon walls like a banshee's wail. "Down!" Daniel shouted, wheeling his horse around as arrows began whistling through the air with deadly precision. "Everyone take cover behind the rocks!" Rebecca's world exploded into chaos. Her horse reared in terror as gunfire erupted from concealed positions above them, and she fought to stay in the saddle while bullets whined past her head like angry hornets. She'd never heard the sound of combat before, the sharp crack of rifles, the screams of wounded men, the thunder of hooves on stone, and the sensory overload threatened to paralyze her with fear. "Rebecca!" Daniel's voice cut through the noise as he grabbed her horse's bridle, steadying the animal. "Get behind that boulder and stay down. Don't try to help, just stay alive." She slid from the saddle and scrambled toward the shelter of a large rock formation, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. From her hiding place, she could see the battle unfolding with terrifying clarity. Iron Wolf's warriors had positioned themselves perfectly, using the canyon walls to rain down arrows and rifle fire on the trapped travelers below. Daniel and his men responded with the practiced efficiency of fighters who'd learned their trade through bitter experience. Pete took position behind an overturned wagon wheel, his rifle barking steadily as he picked targets among the rocks above. Tommy Morrison used his horse as mobile cover, firing and moving to prevent the warriors from getting a clear shot at him, but it was Daniel himself who dominated the fight. Rebecca watched in fascination and horror as he moved through the combat zone with lethal grace, his revolver speaking 6 times in rapid succession before he smoothly reloaded and continued firing. This wasn't the careful, methodical lawman who'd written those thoughtful letters. This was a man who'd been forged by violence into something harder and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The territorial marshals were proving less effective. Marshal Hensley had taken cover behind his horse and was firing wildly at the canyon walls, more concerned with not getting killed than with actually hitting anything. 2 of his men were already wounded, one clutching a bleeding shoulder, while The other tried to stem the flow of blood from an arrow wound in his thigh. "They're trying to flank us," Pete shouted over the gunfire. "Moving down the south wall." Rebecca followed his gaze and saw 3 Kiowa warriors working their way down a narrow ledge that would bring them behind the defenders' position. If they succeeded, the entire group would be caught in a crossfire with no escape route. "I see them," Daniel called back, but he was pinned down by heavy fire from directly above and couldn't move to intercept the flanking attack. "Tommy, can you reach them?" "Negative. They've got me suppressed behind this rock pile." Rebecca realized with crystalline clarity that someone needed to warn the territorial marshals about the flanking movement, or the warriors would be able to attack them from behind while they were focused on the main assault. Hensley and his men were 50 yards away, separated by open ground that was swept by fire from above. The smart thing to do was stay hidden and hope someone else would handle the problem. The safe thing was to remain behind her boulder until the fighting was over, whatever the outcome might be. But as Rebecca watched the 3 warriors getting closer to their flanking position, she understood that sometimes safety and intelligence weren't the most important considerations. Before she could lose her nerve, she sprinted from her cover toward Hensley's position, staying low and zigzagging to make herself a harder target. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet, and at least one arrow passed close enough that she could hear its fletching whisper past her ear, but somehow she reached the territorial marshals without being hit. "Flankers!" she gasped, sliding behind Hensley's improvised barricade. 3 warriors coming down the south wall. They'll be behind you in 2 minutes. Hensley stared at her with a mixture of amazement and horror. "Oh, what the hell are you doing out here? You should be in cover." "I was in cover, but you needed to know about the flankers." Rebecca pointed toward the ledge where the warriors were making their careful descent. "If they get behind you, we're all dead." Hensley followed her gaze and immediately understood the threat. "Jenkins, Patterson, shift your fire to the south wall. We've got hostiles trying to get behind us." The territorial marshals adjusted their position just in time. As the 3 Kiowa warriors reached the bottom of their climbing route and prepared to attack, they found themselves facing ready rifles instead of surprised victims. The brief firefight that followed was sharp and decisive, leaving 2 warriors dead and the 3rd retreating back up the canyon wall. But Rebecca's sprint across open ground had been noticed by the main body of attackers. As she crouched behind Hensley's barricade, she suddenly realized that multiple rifles were now aimed in her direction, their muzzle flashes winking like deadly stars from the rocks above. "They're concentrating fire on our position!" one of Hensley's men shouted. "We need to move!" There was nowhere to move to. The next available cover was 30 yards away, across ground that was now being swept by intensive fire. Rebecca felt the sick realization that her impulsive decision to warn the marshals might have trapped her in an untenable position. That's when Daniel Crawford appeared beside their barricade, like an avenging angel, his face streaked with gunpowder, and his eyes blazing with controlled fury. He'd somehow crossed the same killing ground that had pinned down everyone else, moving with a combination of tactical skill and sheer audacity that took Rebecca's breath away. "What the hell is she doing here?" he demanded of Hensley, but his tone carried more concern than anger. "She came to warn us about flankers," Hensley replied, ducking as another volley of bullets sparked off the rocks around them. "Saved our lives, probably." Daniel looked at Rebecca with an expression she couldn't quite read. That was either very brave or very stupid. "Sometimes there isn't much difference," Rebecca replied, surprised by her own calmness, despite the bullets flying around them. "No," Daniel agreed. "There isn't." He turned his attention to the tactical situation, his mind clearly working through options and possibilities. "We can't stay here. They've got us bracketed, and it's only a matter of time before they work around to another flanking position." "What do you suggest?" Hensley asked. Daniel pointed toward a cluster of large boulders about 40 yards up the canyon. "There. Better cover. Better fields of fire. and it puts us closer to the main trail out of here. But getting there means crossing open ground under fire. That's suicide, one of the wounded marshals protested. They'll cut us down before we make it halfway. Not if we do it right, Daniel replied. Coordinated movement, suppressing fire, and proper timing. Pete and Tommy can keep the warriors' heads down while we move. Rebecca could see the plan forming in Daniel's mind, but she could also see the risks. Even with covering fire, crossing that much open ground would be extremely dangerous. People were going to be wounded or killed, and there was no guarantee that the new position would be any more defensible than their current location. There's another option, she said quietly, and both men looked at her with surprise. Miss Morrison, Hensley began, this really isn't. I can reach that position without being seen, Rebecca interrupted. There's a natural drainage channel that runs along the base of the north wall. It's not deep enough to hide a man, but it might work for someone smaller. Daniel shook his head immediately. Absolutely not. That's far too dangerous. More dangerous than trying to move 12 people across open ground under heavy fire, Rebecca asked. If I can get to those boulders, I can provide covering fire while you move everyone else, or at least draw some of their attention away from your crossing. You don't know how to fight, Daniel protested. You've never fired a shot in anger. Rebecca looked around at the chaos of the battle, at the wounded men and the increasingly desperate situation they were all facing. Then maybe it's time I learned. Before Daniel could stop her, she had grabbed a rifle from one of the wounded marshals and was studying the mechanism with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to her father's bookkeeping. The weapon was heavier than she'd expected, but the basic operation was simple enough. Point, aim, squeeze the trigger. Rebecca, don't be an idiot, Daniel said urgently. This isn't some romantic adventure story. People die in situations like this. People are going to die anyway if we don't try something different, she replied, and I'd rather die trying to help than cowering behind a rock while everyone else takes the risks. She could see the internal struggle playing out in Daniel's features. Part of him wanted to protect her from the violence that had already claimed so much of his life. But another part, the practical lawman who'd learned to use every available resource, could see the tactical merit of her proposal. It won't work, Hensley said. Even if you reach that position, one person with a rifle can't provide enough. Covering fire to make a difference. She won't be alone, said a new voice. They turned to see Tommy Morrison sliding into their position, his young face grim with determination. I can reach the same spot using the drainage channel. 2 rifles, or better than 1. Daniel looked from Rebecca to Tommy, then up at the warriors, who continued to pour fire down on their position. She could see him calculating odds, weighing risks, trying to find any alternative to sending 2 inexperienced fighters on a mission that could easily get them both killed. There's no time, Pete's voice called from across the battlefield. They're massing for another flanking attack. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, Rebecca could see that he'd made his decision. All right, but you follow Tommy's lead. Do exactly what he tells you, and if things go bad, you get the hell out of there. Understood? Understood, Rebecca replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was agreeing to. Tommy checked her rifle quickly, making sure it was loaded and ready to fire. Stay low, move when I move, and don't shoot unless you're sure of your target. Ready? Rebecca nodded, though her heart was beating so fast she could barely breathe. As she prepared to leave the relative safety of the barricade, Daniel caught her arm. Rebecca, he said quietly, his eyes intense with emotion. She couldn't. Quite name, be careful. I just found you. I don't want to lose you before we have a chance to figure out what this could become. The admission hit her harder than any bullet could have. In the middle of a life-or-death battle, surrounded by violence and chaos, Daniel, Crawford had just told her that she mattered to him, not as the mail-order bride he'd expected, but as the woman she was choosing to become. "You won't lose me," she promised, though she had no idea whether she could keep that promise. "We're partners, remember? Partners don't abandon each other when things get difficult." As Rebecca followed Tommy into the drainage channel and began her crawl toward the boulder cluster, she reflected on how drastically her life had changed in the space of a few hours. The proper Philadelphia lady who had stepped off the stagecoach that morning would never have imagined herself crawling through dirt with a rifle in her hands, preparing to fight hostile warriors in the Wyoming wilderness. But that woman had been looking for security and comfort. The woman she was becoming wanted something far more valuable, the chance to stand beside someone worth believing in, regardless of the cost. As bullets whistled overhead and war cries echoed off the canyon walls, Rebecca Morrison discovered that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought for victory, but for the right to choose who you wanted to be when everything you thought you knew about yourself was stripped away. The drainage channel was narrower and shallower than Rebecca had hoped, forcing her to crawl on her belly through mud and sharp stones while bullets whistled overhead. Every few yards, Tommy would signal for her to stop and freeze, while warriors above searched for movement below. The rifle in her hands felt impossibly heavy, and she could taste copper fear on her tongue as they inched toward their destination. "Almost there," Tommy whispered during one of their pauses. "When we reach the boulder cluster, I'll take the high position and you take the low. Don't waste ammunition. Make every shot count." Rebecca nodded, though she had no idea how to make shots count when she'd never fired at anything more dangerous than bottles behind her father's store. The theoretical knowledge of rifle operation was vastly different from the reality of using one in combat, where adrenaline made her hands shake and the noise made it impossible to think clearly. They reached the boulder cluster just as the warriors launched their next coordinated assault. From her new position, Rebecca could see the battle from an entirely different perspective. Daniel and the others were pinned down behind inadequate cover, while nearly 20 Kiowa fighters pressed their attack from multiple directions. "There!" Tommy pointed toward a group of warriors working their way down the canyon wall. "Take the one on the left. I've got the others." Rebecca raised her rifle with hands that trembled despite her efforts to stay calm. Through the iron sights, she could see a painted warrior in buckskins and war paint, his face fierce with concentration as he sought a clear shot at the defenders below. For a moment, the magnitude of what she was about to do paralyzed her. This wasn't target practice or hunting. This was taking a human life. But then she thought of Daniel and the others depending on her to do her part, of the innocent families that Iron Wolf's band had already slaughtered, of the choice between action and paralysis that defined the difference between victim and survivor. Rebecca squeezed the trigger. The rifle's recoil slammed into her shoulder with surprising force, but through the gun smoke she could see the warrior stumble and fall. She'd hit him, though whether fatally or not she couldn't tell. The important thing was that he was no longer shooting at her friends. "Good shot," Tommy called, working his own rifle with practiced efficiency. "Reload and find another target." The next few minutes passed in a blur of smoke, noise, and desperate concentration. Rebecca discovered that combat was nothing like the heroic stories she'd read. It was ugly, terrifying, and utterly exhausting. Her hands became grimy with gunpowder, her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil, and her ears rang from the constant gunfire. But gradually, she began to notice that their position was making a difference. The warriors who had been pressing Daniel's group were now forced to divide their attention between multiple threats. The crossfire from the boulder cluster was disrupting their coordinated attacks and giving the defenders breathing room to organize their own response. "They're pulling back!" Tommy shouted over the gunfire. "Look, they're heading for the horses!" Rebecca could see movement among the rocks as the surviving warriors began a fighting withdrawal toward their hidden mounts. The ambush hadn't gone as planned for Iron Wolf's men, and they were cutting their losses rather than risk further casualties in a prolonged engagement. Within minutes, the canyon fell silent, except for the echoes of departing hoofbeats and the groans of wounded men. Rebecca found herself shaking uncontrollably as the adrenaline that had sustained her through the fight began to ebb, leaving her exhausted and emotionally drained. "You did good," Tommy said, checking her rifle and making sure it was safe. "Real good for someone who's never been in a fight before." Before Rebecca could respond, Daniel appeared at their position, having crossed the battlefield as soon as the firing stopped. His face was streaked with dirt and gunpowder, but his eyes blazed with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "Are you hurt?" he asked, running his hands over her arms and shoulders to check for wounds she might not have noticed. "I don't think so," Rebecca replied, though she was surprised by how much her body ached from the stress of combat. "Is everyone else all right?" Daniel's expression grew somber. "We lost one of Hensley's men. Took an arrow through the throat, right at the beginning. 3 others are wounded, but they'll live if we can get them proper medical attention." The reality of death hit Rebecca harder than she'd expected. While she'd been focused on the tactical aspects of the fight, a man had died, someone with a name and a family and plans for the future that would never be fulfilled. The cost of victory suddenly seemed much higher than she'd understood. "What's his name?" she asked quietly. "Deputy Marshal Frank Patterson," Daniel replied. "He was 26 years old, had a wife and 2 children back in Cheyenne." Rebecca felt tears starting in her eyes, not just for Deputy Patterson, but for the brutal reality of the life she was choosing. Violence wasn't glorious or romantic. It was ugly and final, and left behind grieving families who would never understand why their loved ones had to die. "I killed someone," she said, the words coming out in a whisper. "I shot that warrior. And he fell." Daniel took her hands in his, and she could feel the steadiness of his grip, helping to anchor her against the emotional storm threatening to overwhelm her. "You saved lives today, Rebecca. That warrior you shot was about to kill Pete, or Tommy, or one of the marshals. What you did wasn't murder, it was protection. Does it get easier?" she asked, "living with the knowledge that you've taken a life?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. "No, it doesn't get easier, but it gets necessary, and the day it stops bothering you is the day you need to find a different line of work." Marshal Hensley approached their position, his official demeanor considerably subdued by the violence they'd all just survived. "Marshal Crawford, I need to speak with you." Daniel helped Rebecca to her feet before turning to face the territorial. "Marshal." "What is it, Hensley?" "Those warrants I came to serve," Hensley said slowly. "I'm withdrawing them. What I saw here today, your men fighting to protect civilians, working with my people even though we came to arrest you. That's not the behavior of outlaws." Rebecca felt a surge of relief, but Daniel's expression remained wary. "What changed your mind? Seeing how you operate under pressure, seeing how your people respond to you, and seeing what we're really up against." Hensley gestured toward the canyon walls where the warriors had been positioned. "That wasn't a random raid. That was a coordinated military operation. Iron Wolf's band is bigger and more organized than our intelligence suggested." Tommy Morrison had been listening to this conversation while tending to his rifle. "We've been trying to tell you that for weeks. Iron Wolf isn't just another war. Chief, he's building an alliance that could threaten every settlement from here to the Dakotas." "I'm beginning to understand that," Hensley admitted, "which is why I'm prepared to offer you official territorial authorization for your pursuit. Work with us instead of around us, and we can provide you with resources and support you don't have operating alone." Daniel looked at his men, then at Rebecca, clearly weighing the implications of accepting official sanction for their mission. "What kind of resources are you talking about?" "Ammunition, supplies, medical support, and most importantly, intelligence. from other territorial marshals and military posts, plus legal protection for anyone who joins your pursuit. Rebecca could see the appeal of the offer, but she could also see Daniel's reluctance to accept constraints that might hamper his effectiveness. The question was whether cooperation with territorial authority would help or hinder their mission, to stop Iron Wolf before he could launch larger attacks. There would be conditions, Hensley continued: official oversight, regular reports, adherence to territorial law enforcement procedures. Bureaucracy, Pete said with obvious disgust. Paperwork and procedures while people die. Some bureaucracy, Hensley acknowledged. But also legitimacy, resources, and backup when you need it. You can't track Iron Wolf forever with just 5 men and whatever supplies you can carry on horseback. Daniel was studying Rebecca with an expression that mixed concern and calculation. "What do you think?" he asked her. "You're part of this now. You have a right to voice an opinion." The fact that he was asking for her input in front of the other men surprised Rebecca, but it also filled her with a sense of belonging that was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Daniel Crawford wasn't just accepting her presence. He was treating her as a true partner whose judgment he valued. "I think," Rebecca said carefully, "that our goal should be stopping Iron Wolf as quickly and effectively as possible. If working with territorial authority helps us do that, then we should accept the support. But if bureaucratic procedures slow us down or prevent us from acting when action is needed, then we maintain our independence." Hensley nodded approvingly. "That seems reasonable. What if we structured the arrangement as a special territorial commission? You'd have official authority, but with enhanced autonomy to operate as you see fit." Daniel looked around at his men, reading their expressions and weighing their unspoken opinions. "What about supplies and medical attention for the wounded? I can have a supply wagon and a doctor meet us at Fort Bridger within 3 days," Hensley replied, "plus fresh horses and additional ammunition. And if we need to operate outside normal territorial boundaries, the Commission would give you authority throughout the Wyoming Territory and into neighboring areas with proper notification to local authorities." Rebecca could see Daniel softening toward the proposal, but she could also see the wariness that came from months of operating. "Without official support, what guarantees do we have that territorial politics won't interfere with operational decisions?" "My word," Hensley said simply. "And the fact that after today I understand what kind of men you are. You're not outlaws or vigilantes, you're lawmen doing a necessary job under impossible circumstances." The negotiation was interrupted by a commotion from where the wounded were being tended. One of the territorial marshals was calling for help, and Rebecca could see blood seeping through makeshift bandages that clearly weren't adequate for the injuries they were trying to treat. "We need medical attention now," she said urgently. "These men won't survive a 3-day ride to Fort Bridger without proper treatment." Daniel made his decision with the quick certainty that had made him an effective marshal. "Hensley, we'll accept your offer on a trial basis, but our first priority is getting the wounded to safety and medical attention." "Agreed," Hensley replied. "There's a way station about 6 hours' ride from here. They'll have basic medical supplies and a telegraph to summon a doctor from Cheyenne." As the combined group prepared to move out with their wounded, Rebecca found herself riding beside Daniel at the head of the column. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower toward the mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of the light streaming through stained glass windows in her father's church. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel asked quietly. "Accepting Hensley's offer means we'll be operating under official authority, with all the constraints that brings." "Are you sure about me being part of this?" Rebecca countered. "I'm not the wife you expected when you wrote those letters." Daniel smiled, and it was the first time she'd seen him look genuinely happy since their meeting in the ruins of Willowbrook. "No, you're not. You're much more interesting." Interesting enough to risk bureaucratic complications? Interesting. Enough to risk just about anything, Daniel replied, and the sincerity in his voice made Rebecca's heart skip a beat. As they rode toward the way station and whatever challenges lay ahead, Rebecca reflected on how much she'd changed in the space of a single day. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach that morning had been seeking security and comfort. The woman riding beside Daniel Crawford had found something far more valuable: the knowledge that she was capable of rising to meet whatever challenges life presented, no matter how dangerous or uncertain they might be. She'd fired a rifle in combat, helped save lives under fire, and earned the respect of men who lived by standards of courage and competence rather than social convention. More importantly, she'd discovered that partnership didn't require safety or certainty. It just required two people willing to face whatever came next together, regardless of the odds. The mail-order bride who had come west seeking a predetermined future had found something infinitely better: the chance to write her own story, one dangerous and uncertain chapter at a time. 3 weeks after the ambush at Deadman's Canyon, Rebecca had learned to read the Wyoming wilderness like a book written in tracks, broken twigs, and disturbed earth. She crouched beside a muddy creek bank, studying the hoofprints that told the story of Iron Wolf's passage with the same attention she'd once devoted to her father's ledgers in Philadelphia. 15 horses. Maybe 16, she said quietly to Daniel, who was examining scratches on a nearby cottonwood tree. Moving fast, but not in panic. They stopped here to water the horses and refill canteens. Daniel nodded approvingly. Over the past weeks, Rebecca had shown an unexpected aptitude for tracking that had surprised even his experienced men. Her methodical mind, trained by years of detail-oriented bookkeeping, proved perfectly suited to reading the subtle signs that raiders left in their wake. "How long ago?" Tommy Morrison asked, checking the consistency of the horse droppings with the practiced expertise of someone who'd spent his life around livestock. 6 hours, maybe 8, Rebecca replied, noting how the mud at the water's edge had dried and cracked around the hoofprints. "They're maintaining their lead but not increasing it. Pete Williams, his one arm making every task more difficult. But his experience invaluable, studied the terrain ahead with the eye of a man who'd spent decades reading landscapes for tactical advantages. They're heading for the Sweetwater River crossing. If we push hard, we might catch them before they reach the Badlands." The expanded tracking party had grown to 12 men since Marshal Hensley had formalized their territorial commission. The Sur. Additional marshals brought expertise and resources that Daniel's original group had lacked, but they also brought complications that sometimes slowed decision-making and created friction between different approaches to law enforcement. Marshal Crawford, called Deputy Marshal James Sullivan, one of Hensley's men who still struggled with the informal command structure that Daniel's group had developed. "The horses need rest. We've been pushing them hard for 3 days. Daniel looked up from the tree scratches he'd been studying, his expression showing the strain of balancing multiple concerns: the need for speed in pursuing Iron Wolf, the welfare of men and animals under his command, and the political complexities of working within territorial authority while maintaining operational effectiveness. "How are the wounded?" he asked, referring to the 2 marshals who were still recovering from injuries sustained in the canyon ambush. "Deputy Morrison is holding up well," Reverend Walsh replied. The minister had remained with their group after the stagecoach passengers had been safely escorted to the next settlement, claiming a divine calling to provide spiritual support for their mission. "Deputy Carter is struggling more. The shoulder wound isn't healing properly." Rebecca moved closer to examine Carter's injury, having learned basic field medicine out of necessity during their weeks on the trail. The bullet wound was showing signs of infection despite their best efforts at treatment, and she could see fever in the man's eyes that spoke of systemic complications. "He needs proper medical attention," she said quietly to Daniel. more than we can provide in the field. Daniel studied his wounded man with the expression of a leader who'd learned to make hard choices about competing priorities. Delaying the pursuit to get Carter medical treatment could allow Iron Wolf to escape into territory where tracking would become nearly impossible. But continuing to push a seriously wounded man could result in his death from preventable complications. "There's a telegraph station at Sweetwater Crossing," Marshal Hensley said, consulting the territorial map they'd been using to coordinate their pursuit. "We could send word ahead to Fort Steele, have them dispatch a doctor to meet us there." "That's 2 days' ride," Rebecca observed. "Can Carter make it that far?" Before anyone could answer, the decision was taken out of their hands by the sound of approaching horses from the direction they'd come. Daniel immediately signaled for defensive positions, but the riders who appeared were wearing the blue uniforms of cavalry rather than the war paint of hostile warriors. Captain Marcus Reed of the 4th Cavalry dismounted near their position with the bearing of a professional soldier who'd spent years dealing with frontier complexities. His weathered face and competent manner immediately commanded respect from both groups of marshals. "Marshal Crawford," Reed said, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm Captain Reed from Fort Steele. We've been tracking the same war party you're pursuing." Daniel accepted the handshake, but his expression remained wary. "What's the Army's interest in Iron Wolf?" 3 days ago, his band hit a supply convoy heading for the Montana mining camps. Killed 8 soldiers and a civilian teamster, made off with enough weapons and ammunition to outfit a much larger force. Reed's voice carried the controlled anger of a military officer who'd lost men under his command. Rebecca felt a chill as she realized the implications. Iron Wolf wasn't just raiding for horses and supplies anymore. He was systematically acquiring military-grade weapons that could make his force much more dangerous to larger settlements and fortified positions. "How many men do you have, Captain?" Daniel asked. 40 troopers, plus a medical corpsman who could tend to your wounded." Reed gestured toward Deputy Carter, whose condition was obviously deteriorating. "We're prepared to coordinate our pursuit with your operation." The offer was tempting, but Rebecca could see Daniel weighing the advantages of military support against the constraints that formal army involvement would impose. Cavalry units moved more slowly than the small, mobile tracking party they'd assembled, and military procedures might interfere with the flexible tactics that had allowed them to stay close to Iron Wolf's trail. "What are you proposing, Captain?" Hensley asked, clearly intrigued by the possibility of overwhelming force rather than the cat-and-mouse game they'd been playing for weeks. "Combined operation. Your tracking expertise and knowledge of Iron Wolf's patterns, our firepower and logistics. Support. We coordinate movements to box him in rather than just chasing him across half of Wyoming territory." Tommy Morrison had been studying the cavalry troopers with the critical eye of someone who'd learned to evaluate fighting men under pressure. "How much frontier experience do your people have, Captain? Tracking war parties isn't the same as parade ground drilling." Reed's expression showed that he understood the implications of the question. "Half my men are veterans of campaigns against the Sioux and Cheyenne. The other half are new to frontier service, but they're well-trained and disciplined." Disciplined. "Soldiers can still panic when arrows start flying," Pete observed grimly, "and panic in a fight gets people killed." Rebecca had been listening to this discussion while continuing to study the tracks around the creek bank. Something about the pattern of movement was bothering her, a detail that didn't fit with the straightforward pursuit scenario they'd been assuming. "Captain Reed," she said, interrupting the tactical discussion, "when was your supply convoy attacked?" 3 days ago, about 60 miles northeast of here." Rebecca felt pieces clicking together in her mind. "Iron Wolf was here 6 hours ago, moving southwest. Your convoy was hit 3 days ago to the northeast. That means we're not following the same war party," Daniel finished, understanding immediately where her reasoning was leading. The revelation hit the entire group like a physical blow. If Iron Wolf's band had split up, or if there were multiple coordinated groups operating in the territory, then their weeks of patient tracking might have been following the wrong set of raiders. "Jesus Christ," Sullivan muttered. "How many war parties are we dealing with?" Captain Reed was consulting a detailed military map, marking positions and dates with the precision of someone trained in tactical analysis. "If Miss Morrison is correct, then we're looking at coordinated operations involving at least 2 separate groups, possibly more, which explains how they've been able to hit so many targets so quickly," Daniel said, his voice carrying the frustration of a man who'd discovered that the situation was far more complex than he'd understood. "We've been chasing shadows while the real threat was developing elsewhere." Rebecca studied the tracks again, this time looking for details that might reveal the size and composition of the group they'd been following. "This group is smaller than we thought. Maybe 8 warriors, not 15. And they're moving with purpose, not just raiding randomly." "Purpose toward what?" Hensley asked. Before Rebecca could answer, Tommy Morrison called urgently from his position watching the back trail. "Riders coming fast, at least a dozen, moving like they know exactly where we are, the peaceful creek." The crossing suddenly became a potential trap as the combined tracking party realized they might be the ones being hunted. Daniel immediately began issuing orders with the calm authority that had made him an effective leader under pressure. "Captain Reed, deploy your men for defense. Marshal Hensley, get the wounded into whatever cover we can find. Everyone else, prepare for contact but don't shoot unless I give the order." As the mysterious riders approached, Rebecca found herself checking her rifle and preparing for what might be another violent confrontation. But something about the approaching horsemen struck her as different from the war party that had ambushed them at Dead Man's Canyon. "They're not Indians," she said, studying the distant figures through field glasses that Captain Reed had provided. "White men, riding hard, but flying a flag of some kind." Daniel took the glasses and studied the approaching riders carefully. "Territorial marshals," he announced with relief, "probably carrying dispatches or intelligence about Iron Wolf's activities." The lead rider proved to be Deputy Marshal Frank Harrison from Cheyenne, carrying urgent messages that would completely change their understanding of the threat they were facing. As Harrison's horse slid to a stop beside their position, his face showed the strain of someone who'd been riding hard with extremely bad news. "Marshal Crawford," Harrison gasped, accepting a canteen of water while trying to catch his breath. "You need to know what's happening. Iron Wolf isn't just building a war party, he's organizing a confederation." Daniel felt his stomach drop as the implications became clear. How many tribes? Kiowa, Cheyenne, Arapaho, even some Sioux bands from the north. Our intelligence estimates suggest he's gathered nearly 300 warriors, and they're moving toward the territorial capital. The number was staggering. 300 coordinated warriors represented a military force capable of overwhelming any settlement in Wyoming territory, including heavily defended positions like Fort Laramie or even Cheyenne itself. "When?" Captain Reed asked, his military training immediately focusing on timeline and defensive preparations. "Within the week, possibly sooner. They've been staging supplies and coordinating movements for months. All those small raids we've been tracking were just preparation for something much bigger." Rebecca felt the weight of revelation settling on her shoulders. While they'd been chasing a small group of raiders across the wilderness, Iron Wolf had been implementing a strategic plan that threatened every white settlement in the territory. Their tracking mission, which had seemed so important, was just a sideshow to a much larger and more dangerous operation. "What are our orders?" Hensley asked, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of the threat they were facing. Harrison consulted his dispatch case, pulling out official documents sealed with territorial authority. All available marshals and military units are to converge on Cheyenne for the defense of the territorial capital. Governor Campbell is declaring martial law and calling up every man who can hold a rifle. Daniel was studying the military map with new understanding, seeing the pattern of raids and movements that had seemed random but were actually part of a coordinated strategy to weaken territorial defenses and gather intelligence for a major assault. "We've been played," he said grimly. "Every move we've made, every position we've taken, Iron Wolf has been watching and learning. He's used our pursuit to map our capabilities and response patterns." "So what do we do now?" Tommy asked. "Head for Cheyenne and join the defense." Daniel looked around at his people, the wounded marshals who needed medical attention, the cavalry troopers who were trained for frontier warfare, the territorial officials who represented legal authority, and Rebecca, who had become far more than just a mail-order bride seeking security. "We do what we've been doing," he said finally. "We track Iron Wolf and his confederation, gather intelligence about their plans and movements, and find ways to disrupt their operation before they can launch their assault on Cheyenne." "With 12 people against 300 warriors?" Sullivan asked incredulously. "With 12 people who know this territory, understand Iron Wolf's methods, and can move faster than any large military force," Daniel replied. "Sometimes a small mobile unit can accomplish what an army can't." Rebecca felt purpose crystallizing in her mind as she understood what Daniel was proposing. Instead of joining the static defense of Cheyenne, they would become a disruption force, using their tracking skills and mobility to harass Iron Wolf's confederation and potentially prevent the coordinated assault that threatened the entire territory. "It's dangerous," she said quietly. "Probably suicidal." "Probably," Daniel agreed, "but it's also necessary, and it's what we've been training for without knowing it." As the combined group prepared to continue their pursuit with new understanding of the stakes involved, Rebecca realized that her journey from Philadelphia mail-order bride to frontier tracker was about to enter its most challenging phase. The woman who had once sought security through marriage was now committed to a mission that could determine the fate of thousands of innocent people. But as she checked her rifle and prepared to mount her horse, Rebecca discovered that she'd never felt more certain about anything in her life. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever sacrifices might be required, she was exactly where she belonged, standing beside a man worth believing in, facing impossible odds in defense of something larger than themselves. The morning of Iron Wolf's planned assault on Cheyenne dawned clear and cold, with frost covering the grassland where Rebecca lay hidden behind a rocky outcrop, watching the largest gathering of hostile warriors she'd ever seen. Through her field glasses, she could count nearly 250 painted fighters from multiple tribes, all armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and the modern rifles they'd captured from military convoys. "Sweet Mary," Tommy Morrison whispered beside her. "Look at the organization. They're not just a war party, they're a proper army." Rebecca had to agree. Instead of the chaotic mob she'd expected, Iron Wolf's confederation moved with military precision. Different tribal groups maintained distinct positions while coordinating their movements through a system of signals and messengers that spoke of careful planning and unified command. "There," Daniel said quietly, pointing toward a group of leaders gathered around a large map spread on the ground. "Iron Wolf himself." Through the field glasses, Rebecca could see the war chief who had haunted their pursuit for weeks. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with the bearing of a natural leader and intelligence that radiated even at a distance. This wasn't a savage driven by bloodlust. This was a strategic mind who understood exactly what he was attempting to accomplish. "He's brilliant," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "Look how he's positioned the different tribal groups. Kiowa on the flanks for mobility, Cheyenne in the center for shock assault, Arapaho in reserve for exploitation. This is textbook military tactics. Captain Reed, who was coordinating the cavalry element of their disruption force, nodded grimly. Someone taught him European warfare, probably a deserter or a trader with military experience. The past 3 days had been a desperate race to reach this position before Iron Wolf could launch his assault. Their small force had pushed men and horses to the limits of endurance, surviving on minimal sleep and whatever food they could find, while tracking the Confederation's movement toward the territorial capital. But now, hidden in the rocks overlooking Iron Wolf's staging area, Rebecca realized they faced a tactical problem that might be impossible to solve. Their force of 12 marshals and 40 cavalry troopers was completely outnumbered, and any direct assault would be suicidal against such overwhelming odds. "We can't fight them," she said quietly to Daniel. "Not head-on. We need to disrupt their coordination somehow." Daniel was studying the enemy camp with the focused attention of a man searching for any advantage that might even the odds. Their strength is their organization. "If we can break that." "How?" Pete Williams asked. "We don't have enough men to attack multiple positions simultaneously." Rebecca continued watching the Confederation through her field glasses, noting patterns of movement and communication that might reveal weaknesses. The different tribal groups were maintaining their distinct identities even within the larger force, which suggested that Iron Wolf's unity might be more fragile than it appeared. "The horses," she said suddenly. "Look at how they're managing the horse herds." Daniel followed her gaze to where hundreds of horses were being held in a large natural corral formed by rocky outcrops. "What about them?" "Each tribe is responsible for their own animals, but they're all mixed together in the same area. If something spooked the entire herd—" "Stampede," Tommy finished, understanding immediately. "Scatter the horses and the Confederation loses its mobility." Captain Reed was nodding as he grasped the tactical implications. "Without horses, they can't coordinate movement between tribal groups. They become separate forces instead of a unified army. And without coordination, they can't maintain the assault on Cheyenne," Daniel added. "The territorial militia might actually have a chance against scattered attacks instead of a coordinated assault." The plan was audacious and extremely dangerous. Getting close enough to stampede the horse herd would require penetrating deep into enemy territory, past sentries and warriors who would kill them without hesitation if discovered. But it offered their only realistic chance of disrupting Iron Wolf's carefully orchestrated attack. "We'll need a diversion," Marshal Hensley said, studying the enemy positions. "Something to draw attention away from the horse herd while a team moves into position." "I can provide that," Captain Reed offered. "A cavalry demonstration on their eastern flank. Make them think we're preparing a frontal assault." Rebecca was already calculating timing and distances, her methodical mind working through the logistics of coordinating multiple moving pieces. The stampede team needs to be in position before the diversion begins. Once the horses start running, everything happens fast. "Who goes for the horses?" Daniel asked, though his expression suggested he'd already made the decision. "You, me, and Tommy," Rebecca said. "We're the best at moving quietly, and we know each other well enough to coordinate without talking." Daniel shook his head immediately. "Rebecca, this is too dangerous. If we're caught, we die," she interrupted. "But if we don't try, everyone in Cheyenne dies. I didn't come this far and learn this much just to watch from the sidelines when everything matters most." The argument that followed was brief but intense. Daniel's protective instincts warred against his recognition that Rebecca had become an integral part of their operation, someone whose skills and judgment were essential to their mission's success. "She's right," Pete said finally. "We need our best people for this, and she's proven herself under fire." Besides, Tommy added with a grin that didn't quite hide his nervousness, someone needs to keep you two from getting yourselves killed through excessive heroism. As the sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the grassland, the final preparations began. Captain Reed deployed his cavalry for the diversionary attack, while the marshals established positions to provide covering fire for the escape route. Rebecca checked her rifle and the small supply of gunpowder they'd prepared for creating noise and confusion among the horses. "Rebecca," Daniel said quietly as they prepared to move out, "there's something I need to tell you before we do this." She looked at him, seeing emotion in his eyes that he'd kept carefully controlled throughout their weeks together. "What is it? When I wrote those letters to you, when I offered marriage to a woman I'd never met, I thought I was being practical, looking for a partnership that could grow into something meaningful over time." Rebecca felt her heart begin to race as she realized where this conversation was leading. "And now? Now I know that what I feel for you isn't something that grew over time. It's something that hit me like lightning the moment I saw you standing in the ruins of Willowbrook, refusing to run away from danger." Daniel took her hands in his, and she could feel the calluses from weeks of hard riding and fighting. "I love you, Rebecca Morrison. Not because you're convenient or practical or because I need a wife. I love you because you're the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever met." The words hit Rebecca harder than any bullet could have. In the middle of preparing for what might be their final mission, with death lurking around every decision, Daniel Crawford had just given her the most precious gift imaginable. The knowledge that she was loved not for what she could provide, but for who she had chosen to become. "I love you too," she whispered, meaning it more completely than she'd ever meant anything in her life. "When I stepped off that stagecoach in Willowbrook, I was looking for security. What I found was something infinitely better, the chance to become someone worth loving." Their kiss was brief but intense, carrying all the emotion they might never have another chance to express. Then duty called them back to the immediate reality of their mission. Moving through the tall grass toward Iron Wolf's horse herd required every skill Rebecca had learned during their weeks of tracking. Each step had to be planned, each movement coordinated to avoid detection by the sentries who patrolled the perimeter of the Confederation camp. The horses sensed their approach long before any human guard did. Rebecca could see ears pricking forward and heads turning in their direction as the animals caught unfamiliar scents on the wind. The key was to get close enough to create effective chaos without alerting the warriors who were responsible for herd security. "There," Tommy whispered, pointing toward a cluster of particularly nervous horses near the center of the herd. "Stampede. Those and the rest will follow." Daniel was already preparing the charges they'd need to create noise and confusion. "On my signal, we light everything at once and get the hell out of here." The diversion began right on schedule. Captain Reed's cavalry charged toward the eastern edge of Iron Wolf's camp, with bugles blowing and sabers flashing in the morning sun. The demonstration was purely for show. The cavalry would wheel away before making actual contact. But it served its purpose of focusing enemy attention away from the horse herd. "Now," Daniel whispered. Rebecca lit her charges and threw them into the middle of the nervous horses, while Daniel and Tommy did the same from different positions. The explosions weren't large, but in the confined space of the natural corral, they created exactly the kind of sudden noise and confusion that would trigger a stampede. The effect was immediate and devastating. Hundreds of horses erupted into panicked flight, flowing like a living river through the gaps in the rocky outcrops that had contained them. Warriors shouted and scrambled to avoid being trampled as their carefully organized transportation dissolved into chaos. But as Rebecca, Daniel, and Tommy sprinted toward their escape route, Iron Wolf himself appeared directly in their path. The War Chief had realized what was happening and positioned himself to intercept the saboteurs responsible for destroying his Confederation's mobility. "The woman," Iron Wolf said in heavily accented English, his rifle aimed directly at Rebecca's chest. "You are the one who has been tracking us, learning our ways." Rebecca felt time slow as she realized they were caught in the open with no cover and no chance of reaching their weapons before Iron Wolf could fire. But instead of fear, she felt a strange calm as she met the War Chief's intelligent eyes. "Yes," she said simply, "I've been learning your ways, and I've learned that you're not just a savage, you're a leader trying to protect your people from encroachment and destruction." Iron Wolf's expression showed surprise at her acknowledgement of his motivations. "Then you understand why this war is necessary." "I understand why you think it's necessary," Rebecca replied. "But I also understand that killing innocent families in Cheyenne won't save your people. It will just bring more soldiers, more violence, more death on both sides." "The whites will never stop coming," Iron Wolf said bitterly. "They will take everything until there is nothing left for the people." "Maybe," Rebecca admitted, "but maybe there's another way. A way that doesn't require children to die for the mistakes of adults." Daniel was watching this exchange with amazement, realizing that Rebecca was attempting to negotiate with Iron Wolf, even while facing certain death. Around them, the Confederation camp was dissolving into chaos as warriors tried to recapture scattered horses and restore order to their disrupted assault plans. "You speak of peace," Iron Wolf said, "but your soldiers are attacking my warriors even now." "That's a diversion," Rebecca said honestly. "We came to stop your assault on Cheyenne, but we don't have to be enemies forever. There are people in the territorial government who understand that this land is big enough for everyone if we can find ways to share it." Iron Wolf studied her for a long moment, and Rebecca could see him weighing her words against the anger and frustration that had driven him to organize this massive assault. "You believe this is possible?" "I believe it's worth trying," she replied, "because the alternative is endless war that destroys everyone we care about." The War Chief's rifle remained trained on her chest, but Rebecca could see uncertainty in his eyes. Behind him, the chaos of the scattered horse herd was making it impossible for the Confederation to maintain its coordinated structure. Iron Wolf lowered his rifle slowly, his expression showing respect rather than anger. "You are a worthy enemy, white woman. In another time, another place, we might have been allies." "We still could be," Rebecca said, "if we both choose to be." As Iron Wolf disappeared into the chaos of his disrupted camp, Rebecca felt Daniel's arms around her, holding her tight against the reality of how close they'd come to dying. Around them, the Confederation was beginning to break apart as different tribal groups dealt with the loss of their horses in different ways. "It's over," Tommy said with amazement. "We actually did it." But Rebecca was already thinking beyond the immediate victory to the larger challenges that lay ahead. Stopping Iron Wolf's assault was just the beginning. Now came the harder task of building something better than endless conflict between competing peoples who shared the same land. As they made their way back to Captain Reed's position, Rebecca realized that her journey from mail-order bride to frontier diplomat was entering a new phase. The woman who had once sought security through marriage had discovered something far more valuable: the ability to bridge differences and find solutions that preserved what was worth saving on both sides of any conflict. 6 months later, Rebecca stood on the porch of the house that she and Daniel had built together in the new settlement of Harmony Creek, reading a letter from the territorial governor about the peace negotiations that were slowly, carefully establishing frameworks for coexistence between white settlers and tribal nations. The mail-order bride, who had come west seeking a predetermined future, had instead found the opportunity to help write a different kind of story. One where love, courage, and the willingness to understand former enemies could create possibilities that nobody had imagined. And as Daniel approached along the main street of their thriving community, returning from his rounds as territorial marshal for the region, Rebecca reflected on how perfectly their partnership had evolved from those first tentative letters into something that strengthened both of them while serving something larger than themselves. The future they were building together wasn't the one either of them had planned, but it was infinitely better than anything they could have achieved alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.